There's a specific moment every person who has ever loved an avoidant partner knows intimately, even if they've never had the language to describe it until now. It's not the silence itself. You've already survived that. The days, sometimes weeks, of unanswered messages, the withdrawal that came without warning, without explanation, without any indication of when, or if they'd ever resurface. You've already lived through the anxious spiral, the countless theories you constructed trying to understand what happened, the exhausting cycle of checking your phone every few minutes hoping for a sign that you hadn't simply been erased from someone's life without a word. No, the moment we're talking about today is different. It's the moment after the silence finally breaks. The moment an avoidant person, after weeks or months of complete withdrawal, suddenly reappears. And what happens in that exact instant, in the very first few seconds of finally facing you again, reveals something so predictable, so consistent across nearly every avoidant attachment pattern, that once you understand it, you'll never be confused by it again. Because here's what almost nobody explains properly about avoidant attachment. The return isn't random. It isn't simply when they finally felt ready. It follows an internal script so specific, so consistently patterned across different people with this attachment style, that psychologists who study attachment theory can predict, almost to the letter, exactly what's about to happen the moment an avoidant finally faces the person they disappeared on. And today, we're going to walk through exactly what that moment looks like, why it happens the way it does, and most importantly, what it actually reveals about what was happening inside them during all that silence you spent agonizing over. Let's start with the single most important thing to understand about avoidant attachment before we go any further. Because everything else we discuss today builds on this foundation, the silence was never actually about you in the way it felt like it was. This is almost impossible to believe when you're the one on the receiving end of it, because from your perspective, the withdrawal feels intensely personal. You replay every conversation before the silence began, searching for the exact moment you said or did something that triggered this disappearance. You construct elaborate narratives about what you must have done wrong, what flaw in you finally became too much, what fatal mistake pushed them away after everything seemed to be going well. But here's what's actually happening on the other side of that silence. Inside the mind of someone with genuine avoidant attachment, the withdrawal isn't a response to something you did wrong. It's a response to intimacy itself, to closeness reaching a threshold their nervous system was never taught how to tolerate. This is crucial to understand because it completely reframes everything that happens next. Avoidant attachment doesn't develop randomly. It forms almost always in early childhood, in environments where emotional needs were met with discomfort, dismissal, or even punishment. A child who reaches for comfort and receives irritation instead learns, quickly and permanently, that needing closeness is dangerous. A child whose emotional expression was met with, "Stop crying," or "You're too sensitive," or simple, cold indifference learns that vulnerability isn't safe, that the people who are supposed to provide comfort cannot actually be relied upon to provide it consistently, and that the safest strategy, ultimately, is self-sufficiency so complete that no one else's presence or absence can ever threaten your stability again. This wiring doesn't disappear in adulthood. It simply relocates from parent-child relationships into romantic ones, where the same nervous system that once learned closeness equals danger now activates every time a relationship starts moving toward genuine intimacy, genuine vulnerability, genuine emotional interdependence. This is exactly what triggers the disappearance you experienced. Not a single event, usually, though sometimes there's a specific moment that intensifies the activation. A conversation about the future, an "I love you," spoken too soon for their internal timeline, a level of emotional exposure that suddenly felt, to their nervous system, like standing too close to an edge they've spent their entire life avoiding. And here's the part that's so difficult to accept, but so important to understand: the silence that followed wasn't cruelty. Exactly, even though it certainly felt cruel to experience. It was their nervous system's oldest, most deeply grooved survival strategy activating exactly the way it was trained to activate. Decades before you ever entered their life, you didn't cause this pattern. You simply got close enough to trigger it. Now, here's where things get genuinely fascinating, because understanding what happens during the silence itself is crucial to understanding what happens the moment it finally breaks. Contrary to what you might assume, an avoidant person's silence isn't usually filled with the same peace their external behavior seems to project. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant attachment, because from the outside, someone who's gone completely silent, who seems capable of simply walking away without any visible distress, appears to be handling the separation with far more ease than the person left behind, anxiously waiting for any sign of contact. But research into avoidant attachment consistently reveals something that contradicts this outward appearance almost entirely. Avoidant individuals, despite their outward calm, often experience significant internal distress during periods of withdrawal. They simply lack the internal architecture to process or express that distress the way someone with a different attachment style might. Their nervous system doesn't offer them the option of reaching out for comfort during difficulty, because reaching out for comfort is precisely the behavior their childhood taught them was dangerous in the first place. So instead, what actually happens during that silence is something closer to a private, unexpressed reckoning. They're not simply moving on, unaffected, the way it might appear from the outside. They're wrestling, often without full, conscious awareness of what they're wrestling with, between two competing forces that have been at war inside them for their entire life: the genuine desire for connection, for closeness, for the specific person they just withdrew from, and the deeply ingrained belief, wired so early it feels like instinct rather than learned behavior, that closeness inevitably leads to engulfment, loss of self, or eventual abandonment anyway. So better to control the ending than risk being blindsided by it. This internal war is exhausting, even though it produces almost no visible external signs. And it's precisely this internal exhaustion, this unresolved tension between wanting you and fearing what wanting you represents, that eventually determines whether the silence ends with genuine return or with permanent, final disappearance. Because here's something crucial to understand about avoidant withdrawal that separates it into two very different categories, and knowing which category you're dealing with changes everything about how to interpret what happens next. Not every avoidant silence ends the same way, and the reasons behind why some end in return while others end in permanent absence reveal something profound about the specific person you're dealing with, and whether what happens next is actually worth waiting for at all. Let's talk about what actually determines which path a specific silence takes, because this distinction matters enormously for anyone currently living inside one of these agonizing waiting periods, desperately trying to figure out whether to hold on or finally let go. The silences that eventually break, that result in genuine return rather than permanent disappearance, almost always share a specific quality. The connection itself was real enough, meaningful enough, to eventually outweigh the fear driving the withdrawal in the first place. This doesn't mean the return happens quickly, or painlessly, or without significant internal struggle along the way, but it means that somewhere inside that internal war we just described, the desire for closeness fighting against the fear of it, desire eventually gains enough ground to override the avoidant pattern's default setting of permanent retreat. The silences that end in permanent disappearance, by contrast, usually indicate something different, something worth understanding clearly rather than hoping around. Sometimes it means the fear was simply too dominant, too deeply entrenched for this particular relationship to ever fully activate enough desire to overcome it. Sometimes it means the avoidant person has used the silence not as a genuine internal struggle, but as a convenient exit from a relationship they'd already quietly decided wasn't worth the discomfort of pursuing further. And sometimes, painfully, it simply means timing, that this person's capacity for genuine intimacy hasn't developed enough yet, regardless of how real the connection may have felt in the moments before withdrawal began. Understanding this distinction matters because it directly shapes what actually happens in that crucial first moment when an avoidant person finally does return after prolonged silence. And this moment, when it happens, follows a pattern so consistent it's almost eerie once you learn to recognize it. Here's what almost never happens in that first moment of returns: an immediate, overwhelming display of vulnerability. You will rarely, if ever, encounter an avoidant person who returns after weeks of silence and immediately says, "I disappeared because I got scared of how much I feel for you, and I'm sorry for the pain that caused you." This kind of direct, emotional transparency requires exactly the skill set avoidant attachment prevents from developing naturally, which means it's almost never how the return actually unfolds, even when genuine internal reckoning has occurred during the silence. Instead, what typically happens is something far more understated, often frustratingly so for the person who spent the silence in agonizing anxiety, desperate for exactly the kind of clear emotional accounting that almost never arrives. The return usually begins with something casual, almost deliberately low stakes. A message that doesn't directly address the silence at all, sometimes acting as though minimal time has passed, sometimes offering a vague, insufficient explanation that clearly doesn't capture the full internal experience that actually occurred during the withdrawal. This can feel deeply invalidating to the person on the receiving end, understandably so. After enduring weeks of anxious silence, receiving a casual, "Hey, how have you been?" instead of genuine acknowledgement of the pain caused can feel almost insulting, as though the entire ordeal is being minimized or dismissed entirely. But here's what's actually happening underneath that seemingly casual reappearance. And understanding this is crucial to interpreting what you're witnessing accurately. The casualness isn't a genuine reflection of how lightly they're treating the situation. It's a protective mechanism, allowing them to re-enter the relationship without having to fully expose the vulnerability of what actually happened during their absence. Direct acknowledgement of their fear, their internal struggle, their genuine feelings about you. All of this requires an emotional exposure that feels, to their nervous system, exactly as dangerous as the closeness that triggered the withdrawal in the first place. This is why so many people report a strange, disorienting experience when an avoidant partner finally returns. The casual tone of their reappearance seems to contradict the internal struggle you now understand was actually happening during the silence. This contradiction isn't a sign that the struggle wasn't real. It's a sign that even the return itself is happening according to the same protective architecture that caused the withdrawal. Minimal exposure, controlled vulnerability, careful management of how much genuine emotion gets revealed in any single interaction. There's often a second, subtler layer to this return that reveals even more about what actually happened during the silence, if you know to look for it. Watch, in the days and weeks that follow the initial reappearance, for small, indirect signals of what they experienced. Not through direct statements, but through behavior. An avoidant person who genuinely struggled during the silence, who genuinely fought against their own instinct to disappear permanently, often shows this through subtle increases in effort that weren't present before the withdrawal happened. Slightly more consistent communication, small gestures of care that seem to appear without being asked for or expected, a softening in moments where they previously would have pulled back defensively. These signals matter far more than anything said directly in that first moment of return, because avoidant individuals, even when genuinely committed to trying again, rarely have access to the direct verbal processing that other attachment styles rely on to communicate internal change. Their growth, when it happens, shows up in action long before it ever shows up in words, if it ever fully arrives in words at all. This is precisely why understanding this pattern matters so much for anyone currently in the position of waiting, wondering, trying to interpret what a partner's eventual return actually means about the relationship's future. Because the question was never really about how they explain themselves in that first conversation after silence. The real question, the one that actually determines whether this relationship has a sustainable future, is what happens in the weeks that follow. Whether the small, indirect signals of genuine internal change actually continue and deepen, or whether the return simply resets the same cycle that led to withdrawal in the first place, destined to repeat itself again the next time intimacy reaches the same uncomfortable threshold. And this is exactly where the real test begins. Not in that first conversation after silence, but in everything that comes after it. Because this is where you finally get to see whether what you're witnessing is genuine growth, or simply the same pattern wearing a temporarily softer disguise. Here's what to watch for. Because this distinction will determine everything about whether this relationship has any real future, or whether you're simply about to enter another cycle of the exact same withdrawal, disguised temporarily by a period of renewed closeness that will eventually trigger the same fear response all over again. Genuine growth in an avoidant partner looks like increasing tolerance for vulnerability over time, not perfect vulnerability immediately, but a visible, gradual expansion of their capacity to stay present during moments of emotional intensity that previously would have triggered withdrawal. It looks like them catching themselves mid-retreat sometimes, even if imperfectly, and choosing, with visible effort, to stay in the conversation instead of disappearing the way they always have before. It looks like small but real acknowledgments, even if delivered awkwardly, even if requiring your patience to receive them fully. I know I get scared when things feel serious. I'm trying to work on that. Words that would have been completely unavailable to them before genuine internal work began. What doesn't indicate genuine growth, no matter how much you might want it to, is a return that simply resumes the relationship exactly where it left off, without any acknowledgement, without any visible effort to build tolerance for the intimacy that triggered the original withdrawal. This pattern, disappear, return casually, resume as if nothing happened, repeat the exact cycle the next time closeness intensifies, isn't growth. It's simply the relationship's established rhythm, one that will likely continue indefinitely unless something forces a genuine confrontation with the underlying pattern itself. This is where you, the person who has now lived through this cycle at least once, hold more power than you might currently realize, because your response to their return matters just as much as their behavior during it. If you simply absorb the casual reappearance, without any acknowledgement of what the silence cost you, without any expectation that this pattern needs to change if the relationship is going to continue, you inadvertently teach them that disappearing carries no real consequence, that you'll always be there unchanged, ready to resume exactly where things left off, regardless of how many times this cycle repeats. This doesn't mean punishing them for a pattern rooted in childhood wounds they didn't choose to develop. It means holding a boundary that communicates something crucial, that you understand where the fear comes from, that you're willing to be patient with genuine effort, but that the relationship cannot survive on a foundation of repeated disappearance, followed by casual, unprocessed return. Real intimacy requires both people showing up to the discomfort eventually, not one person perpetually accommodating the other's inability to stay present during difficulty. This is often the most painful realization for people who love avoidant partners deeply, that your understanding of their attachment wound, your compassion for the childhood pain that created it, doesn't obligate you to accept an indefinite pattern of disappearance and casual return without ever requiring genuine change. Understanding someone's wounds explains their behavior. It doesn't excuse a relationship dynamic that leaves you in a permanent, exhausting state of anxious waiting, wondering when the next silence will begin. So if you're currently living inside this exact moment, watching an avoidant partner return after prolonged silence, trying to interpret what their casual reappearance actually means, wondering whether to hope for something different this time. Here's what you actually need to pay attention to, more than anything they say in that first conversation. Watch what happens next. Watch whether the effort deepens or simply fades back into the same pattern that existed before. Watch whether your own needs, your own pain from the silence, get acknowledged at any point, or whether the expectation remains that you'll simply absorb the disappearance and welcome the return without ever requiring anything different from them. Because here's the truth that ultimately matters more than any attachment theory, any psychological explanation, any compassionate understanding of childhood wounds that shaped a pattern neither of you chose. You deserve a relationship where closeness doesn't require you to survive repeated disappearance. You deserve a partner capable of growth, not just explanation. And while avoidant attachment can absolutely heal, can absolutely transform into something capable of sustained intimacy, that transformation requires genuine, sustained effort from the person carrying the wound, not indefinite patience from the person who keeps getting left behind, waiting for change that may or may not ever actually arrive. The silence and the return that eventually follows it was never actually the real test of this relationship's future. The real test is what happens in all the ordinary, unremarkable days after, whether genuine growth continues to unfold quietly, consistently over time, or whether you're simply watching the beginning of the exact same cycle, ready to repeat itself the moment intimacy reaches its next uncomfortable threshold. And only time, not that first conversation, will ever reveal which one you're actually witnessing.